In the spring of 2003, a family of 4 checked into room 14 of a motel that sat alone on a stretch of 2-lane highway outside a town most people have never heard of. The front desk clerk remembers checking them in. He remembers the father signing the registry, the kids arguing over who got the bed by the window, the mother asking if the ice machine on the second floor actually worked. What nobody remembers, what nobody has ever been able to explain, is checking them out. 11 years later, when the motel finally shut its doors for good, and a demolition crew started tearing the building apart wall by wall, they found a 15th room. A room that didn't exist on any blueprint, any permit, any floor plan filed with the county. A room with no door on the outside of the building, sealed somewhere inside the structure like a tooth that grew in sideways. And inside that room, sitting exactly where it had been set down more than a decade earlier, they found the family's luggage. Still packed, still zipped. I've spent close to 2 months digging into this case, pulling property records, tracking down a clerk who hasn't talked to a journalist in 15 years, and driving out to a lot that, as of right now, is just gravel and weeds. I want to walk you through everything I found, in the order I found it, because some of it doesn't add up no matter how many times I run it through my head, and some of it, honestly, I wish I'd never gone looking for. Pinebrook isn't really a town. It's a crossroads with a gas station, a church, and a population sign that's been wrong for 30 years because nobody's bothered to update it. The Pinebrook Motor Inn sat about 4 miles outside the crossroads proper, built in 1962 by a man named Harold Voss, who ran it with his wife until he died in 1981. After that, it changed hands 4 times in 20 years, which is already a little unusual for a 14-room roadside motel that mostly served truckers and the occasional hunting party passing through in the fall. None of the owners stayed long. None of them ever gave a clear reason for selling. The third owner, a woman named Ruth Castellano, sold the place after only 16 months and moved to Arizona. And when a local reporter asked her years later why she'd left so fast, she reportedly said only that the building didn't like being full. Nobody pushed her on what that meant. I wish someone had. By 2003, the motel was owned by a man named Daryl Quinn, who'd bought it cheap and ran it lean, which is a polite way of saying he didn't spend money on anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The clerk on duty most nights that spring was a 19-year-old named Tobias Reyes, working the desk to save up for community college. Tobias is the one I eventually tracked down, and he's the closest thing this story has to a reliable witness, because he kept a personal journal that spring, mostly to stave off boredom during the overnight shifts. That journal is the reason we know anything at all about the Lang family. The Langs checked in on a Thursday night in April. Marcus Lang, 36, was driving his wife Denise and their 2 kids, Caleb and Ruthie, from somewhere in Pennsylvania to a relative's place out west, the kind of long, boring family road trip that gets broken up into cheap motel stays because nobody can afford a hotel chain for 6 nights running. Tobias's journal describes them as ordinary, in a way that almost feels deliberate, like he wanted to remember exactly how unremarkable it all was, because later it would matter. Marcus paid in cash. Denise asked about the ice machine. The kids fought over the bed by the window, and Ruthie won because she was 8, and Caleb, at 12, had apparently decided it wasn't worth the fight. Tobias gave them room 14, at the far end of the building, away from the highway noise. He remembers Marcus joking that the room number was unlucky in some countries, and Tobias telling him that was room 13, not 14, and Marcus laughing and saying close enough. That's the last conversation anyone has on record with a member of the Lang family. The next morning, Tobias came on shift at 6 and noticed the Langs' car was still in the lot. That wasn't unusual on its own. Checkout wasn't until 11. By 1 in the afternoon, with the car still sitting there and no answer at the door, Daryl Quinn used his master key to let himself into room 14, expecting to find guests who'd overslept or skipped out without paying the incidental fees. The room was empty, not just empty of people. Empty of the family's belongings too, except for 2 things. Ruthie's stuffed rabbit sitting upright on the pillow she hadn't slept on, and the room key placed neatly on the nightstand, the way you'd leave it if you were checking out properly, and just forgot to stop by the desk. The car was processed by police 3 days later, when the family failed to arrive at their relative's house and a missing persons report was filed. It was locked. The keys were never found. Inside, investigators noted, everything looked exactly as you'd expect from a family mid-road trip. Snacks in the back seat, a half-finished crossword in the glove compartment, Caleb's portable game system wedged between the seats. Nothing suggested foul play in any traditional sense. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication anyone had even opened the doors from the inside after the car was parked the night before. It was as if 4 people had simply stepped out of their bodies and walked away, leaving everything, including the car they needed to continue their entire trip, behind. The investigation that followed was, by any honest account, a mess. Jurisdiction got tangled between county sheriff's offices because the motel sat right on a boundary line. The case got handed off twice in the first month alone. Tobias told me that 2 different detectives interviewed him, and neither one seemed to know what the other had already asked, which meant he kept having to repeat himself. And each time he repeated the story, he found himself second-guessing small details. The way you do when you tell something so many times, it stops feeling like a memory and starts feeling like a script. He remembers one detective, an older man whose name he can no longer recall, asking him a strange question near the end of the second interview. The detective asked if Tobias had noticed anything odd about the hallway outside room 14, specifically whether it felt longer than it should walking down it at night. Tobias said he laughed it off at the time. He told me he doesn't laugh about it anymore. Because here's the thing about the Pinebrook Motor Inn that I didn't know until I started pulling old guest reviews and message board posts from the early 2000s. Back when roadside motels still got reviewed on dial-up forums by truckers killing time at rest stops. Multiple guests, going back as far as 1994, nearly a decade before the Langs ever checked in, described the same complaint about that stretch of hallway. They said it felt like it took longer to walk than it should have. A few people, independently of each other, used almost identical phrasing, saying it felt like the hallway stretched at night. One trucker, posting under a handle I won't bother repeating because it's unprintable, wrote a long post in 1997 about checking into room 12, getting up at 2 a.m. to use the vending machine, and walking what felt like 60 or 70 feet down a hallway he knew for a fact was barely 30 feet long, because he'd walked it plenty of times in daylight, he said. He counted steps to prove himself wrong and counted 41 steps, where there should have been about a dozen. He checked out that night and never came back. None of this made it into any official report. None of it was treated as relevant by investigators looking into the Lang disappearance, because none of it fits into a framework that a missing persons case is built to handle. Police look for people who left, people who were taken, people who got hurt. They don't have a box to check for hallways that don't measure the same twice. The Lang case went cold within about 8 months, the way most cases like this do when there's no body, no suspect, and no physical evidence pointing anywhere at all. Daryl Quinn kept the motel running because despite everything, business didn't actually drop off much. Most guests who stayed there had no idea anything had happened, and the ones who did mostly figured it was a domestic situation, a family that ran off for reasons of their own, which is a far more comfortable story than the alternative. Room 14 stayed in rotation. Quinn take it offline, didn't renovate it, didn't do much of anything except change the locks, which feels almost funny in hindsight, given what we now know about that hallway. Over the next several years, a pattern started to emerge that nobody connected at the time, because nobody was looking for a pattern. Staff turnover at the Pinebrook Motor Inn was unusually high for such a small operation. Housekeepers quit within weeks. One woman, according to Tobias, walked out mid-shift in 2006 and refused to come back even to collect her final paycheck, which got mailed to her instead. She told a coworker, who told Tobias, that she'd gone into room 14 to clean and found the bed already made, the bathroom already clean, everything already done. On a day she knew for a fact the room had been occupied the night before and hadn't been touched yet by anyone on staff. She said it felt like the room had cleaned itself, and she said it in a tone that made it clear she didn't mean that as a compliment. By 2009, 6 years after the Langs vanished, Tobias had long since left for college, but he stayed loosely in touch with a couple of former co-workers, and that's how he heard about the second disappearance. This one got even less attention than the first, partly because the man involved, a solo trucker named Glenn Aldous, had no family to report him missing right away, and partly because by the time anyone did notice, weeks had passed and the trail was already cold. Aldous checked into the Pinebrook Motor Inn in November of 2009. Security footage, grainy and black and white, showed him walking down the hallway toward his room at 11:47 p.m. No footage exists of him ever walking back. His truck sat in the lot for 9 days before anyone thought to check on him, and when they finally did, his room was empty in exactly the same way room 14 had been empty in 2003. Keys on the nightstand, belongings gone, no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, nothing except an open door and a bed that hadn't been slept in. Aldous had been assigned room 9, not room 14. That detail matters, because it meant whatever was happening wasn't confined to a single unlucky room. It meant the entire building was involved, or maybe more accurately, that the room itself moved. There's a third name attached to this place that almost nobody outside Pinebrook knows about, and I only found it because of a clerical accident. A woman named Priya Mehta, 31 years old, traveling alone on a research trip for a graduate program, stayed at the Pinebrook Motor Inn for a single night in August 2011. She wasn't reported missing for nearly 3 weeks because her family believed she was still on the road, moving between archives in 3 different states for a thesis on rural infrastructure decline, of all things. By the time her sister grew worried enough to call around, the trail at Pinebrook was cold enough that the local sheriff's department barely connected it to the building's history at all. It was filed as a standard missing persons case, handled by a different deputy than the ones who'd worked the Lang and Aldous disappearances, and as far as I can tell, nobody on staff at the time even cross-referenced the address. I only found Priya's name because a records clerk, helping me dig through 11-year-old county files, mentioned almost in passing that the case number sequence had a gap in it, and when I asked her to pull the missing file out of curiosity, this is what came back. Priya's room was 7, on the opposite end of the building from where the Langs and Aldous had stayed, which initially made me think her case might be unrelated, a coincidence of geography and a motel with genuinely bad luck. But her rental car, like the Lang family's vehicle 8 years earlier, was found locked in the lot with her belongings untouched inside, including a laptop bag with her dissertation notes still in the trunk. Her room key was on the nightstand. Her overnight bag was gone, along with whatever she'd carried in with her, but a single item was left behind on the bed, placed deliberately enough that the responding deputy noted it in his report. A paperback novel, open and face down to hold her place, on a page that, when I tracked down a copy of the same edition, turned out to be the final page of the book. She hadn't finished reading it. Someone or something had set it down as though she had. I tried, more than once, to get Daryl Quinn himself on the record. He's alive, in his late 70s now, living about 90 minutes from where the motel used to stand. He declined every interview request I sent through his attorney, which is his right, and I want to be fair to him here, because nothing in my research suggests he did anything wrong beyond running a business he probably should have closed years before he finally did. But he did respond once, not through his lawyer but directly, in a short voicemail left on my phone at 2 in the morning on a night I hadn't called him at all. His voice was calm, almost flat, and the message lasted 11 seconds. He said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I still have the recording saved, that I needed to stop asking about the room, because it only answers when you knock. Then he hung up, and when I called the number back, it rang through to a disconnected line that, according to the carrier, had been inactive for over a year. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, and I went into this investigation as skeptical as anyone. But the demolition in 2014 is where skepticism started getting genuinely difficult to hold on to, and it's the part of this story I think about more than I'd like to admit. By 2013, the Pinebrook Motor Inn was failing financially. Highway traffic had shifted after a new interstate exit opened 12 miles east, and Daryl Quinn, by then in his 60s and tired in a way that had nothing to do with money, decided to sell the land rather than keep fighting for a business that was already half a ghost. The buyer planned to clear the lot for a storage facility. Demolition began in January 2014, and it was a routine job right up until the crew got to the interior walls separating what should have been rooms 13 and 14 from the back hallway. The site foreman, a man I managed to reach by phone, described it to me in more detail than I expected him to be willing to give. He said his crew broke through a wall they'd assumed was load-bearing, based on the original 1962 blueprints Quinn had provided, and found a cavity behind it roughly the size of a standard motel room. Inside that cavity was a fully finished room. Carpet, wallpaper, a bed, a bathroom with running water still connected to the building's plumbing, even though the room appeared on no schematic anyone had ever filed with the county. There was no door to this room anywhere on the exterior or interior of the building. It had been completely sealed, as far as anyone can tell, since before the motel was even built, or possibly built around, in a way that makes the timeline genuinely hard to reconstruct. And sitting on the floor of that room, untouched, was a set of luggage matching the description Denise Lang's sister had given investigators back in 2003. 2 suitcases, a diaper bag long emptied of anything a toddler would need because Ruthie hadn't been a toddler in years, and a stuffed animal that the foreman described, without knowing anything about the original case, as a kid's toy like a bear or a rabbit, sitting up against the pillow like someone had set it there on purpose. The county reopened the investigation briefly in 2014 once this discovery made local news, though it never got much coverage outside the immediate area, which honestly surprises me, given everything else attached to it. DNA testing on hair found in a brush inside one suitcase confirmed a familial match to samples on file from Denise Lang's sister, who had given a reference sample back in 2003 in case remains were ever found. No remains were found, just luggage, a toy, and a room that, according to every record that exists, should not have been there at all. The foreman told me his crew refused to go back into that section of the building after the second day. He said it wasn't anything dramatic, no screaming, no equipment malfunctioning, nothing you could put in an incident report. He said it was just a feeling that built up over those 2 days. A sense that they were being watched from inside a space that had no windows and, until they broke through the wall, no way for anyone to see out of it at all. One of his workers, a man he'd known for over a decade, quit on the spot and never gave a reason beyond saying he had a family and didn't want to be the next name added to whatever this was. The room was photographed, documented by the county, and then, on Quinn's instructions, sealed back up and demolished along with the rest of the building within the week. I've seen 2 of the photographs because the foreman, against what I assume were his better instincts, sent them to me after our second phone call. I won't describe them in detail beyond what I've already told you, because the details that stuck with me most are the kind that are hard to verify and easy to misremember once fear gets involved. And I'd rather tell you only what I'm confident is true than dress this up with anything I can't stand behind. What I can tell you is this. After the demolition was finished and the lot cleared, the site sat empty for almost a year before the storage facility project fell through, for unrelated financial reasons. It's still empty today. I drove out there myself 2 weeks ago, partly for footage, and partly because I needed to see it for myself before finishing this investigation. There's nothing there now. Gravel, a few support beams left over from the original foundation, weeds growing up through the cracks. I stood roughly where the hallway used to be, based on the foreman's description, and an old photograph Tobias still had tucked away in a box of motel memorabilia he never threw out. I want to tell you nothing happened while I was standing there, because that would be the easier story to tell, and I think part of me wants the easier story too. But I had a recorder running the entire time I was on site, partly out of habit, and partly because something about the place made me want documentation of every second I spent there. When I got home and reviewed the audio, there's a stretch of about 40 seconds where my own footsteps on the gravel, which are clearly audible everywhere else in the recording, simply aren't there. The ambient noise continues. Wind, a distant car on the highway, my own breathing. But no footsteps for 40 seconds in the exact spot where the hallway between rooms 13 and 14 would have stood. I've listened to that section more times than I should probably admit. I've had 2 separate audio technicians look at the file, and neither of them could explain it as a recording artifact or equipment failure. One of them, a guy who's done sound work for true crime productions for 15 years, told me flatly that he didn't want to keep the file on his system longer than necessary to run his analysis, and he wouldn't elaborate on why beyond saying it gave him a feeling he didn't like. There's one more detail I held off on mentioning, because I wanted to verify it as many times as I reasonably could before putting it in front of you. While I was on site, in addition to the audio recorder, I had a camera running on a tripod, set to take a long exposure photograph every few minutes as part of a time-lapse I'd planned to use as background footage. Out of roughly 40 frames captured over the 2 hours I was there, 39 show exactly what you'd expect. Gravel, weeds, the tree line in the distance, the changing light as the sun dropped toward the horizon. One frame, captured at the same timestamp as the missing 40 seconds of footsteps on my audio recorder, shows something different. It's subtle enough that I almost scrolled past it the first time I reviewed the files. In the lower left, in the area roughly corresponding to where the hallway in the sealed room would have stood according to the old blueprints, there's a vertical shape that isn't present in any frame before or after it. It's tall, narrow, and pale, somewhere between the color of old carpet and bare drywall, and it's positioned at a height and proportion that, if you squint and if you let your imagination do what imaginations do, looks uncomfortably like a doorframe standing upright with no walls attached to it at all. I sent that image to 3 people whose judgment I trust, all of whom work in photography or video production professionally, all of whom I asked the same question without telling them what I suspected. Does anything in this frame look out of place to you? 2 of them pointed to the exact same area independently, without any prompting from me, and described it in almost identical language as looking like a doorway. The third person, after a long pause, asked me where the photograph was taken, and when I told her, she asked if she could delete her copy of the file rather than keep it on her device. I let her. I've gone back to the site once more since then, during daylight hours, with 2 other people present, and 3 separate recording devices running simultaneously, in an attempt to either replicate or rule out what happened the first time. Nothing unusual showed up in any of the daylight recordings. No missing footsteps, no anomalous shapes, nothing beyond the ordinary sound of wind moving through grass that hasn't been cut in over a decade. Whatever this is, if it's anything at all beyond an unfortunate string of coincidences and a camera artifact I can't fully explain, it doesn't seem to announce itself on command. It waits. It chose a stretch of 40 seconds on one visit at dusk when I was alone, and as far as I can tell, it has no interest in performing for an audience. I don't have an ending for this one, and I think that's the part that's going to stick with you, the same way it stuck with me. I don't know what happened to Marcus, Denise, Caleb, and Ruthie Lang. I don't know what happened to Glenn Aldous, or whether there were others before him or after that simply never got reported because they were traveling alone with no one to notice they hadn't checked out. I don't know what that room was, why it had no door, why it had running water connected to a building it technically wasn't part of, or why a stuffed rabbit was still sitting upright against a pillow 11 years after a little girl set it there for one ordinary forgettable Thursday night. What I do know is that the land is still sitting there, 4 miles outside a crossroads most maps don't bother labeling, and that nothing has been built on it since, despite at least 2 more attempts by developers who, according to public permit filings, both withdrew their applications within months without explanation. I know that Tobias Reyes, now in his 40s with a family of his own, still keeps a small nightlight on in his hallway at home, a habit he picked up sometime around 2003 and has never been able to shake, even when his wife asks him why a grown man needs a nightlight. And I know that somewhere in a property records office, filed alongside permits and inspection reports for a building that no longer exists, there's a set of 1962 blueprints for the Pinebrook Motor Inn that clearly unambiguously shows 14 rooms, not 15. If you ever find yourself driving that stretch of highway at night and you see an old motel sign still standing, even though the building behind it is long gone, do yourself a favor and keep driving. Some hallways aren't meant to be walked twice. And some rooms, once they've taken something in, were never really built to let it back out.